A 64-year-old Asian American woman was stabbed to death while she was walking her dogs in Riverside, California over the weekend. A 65-year-old Asian American woman was brutally beaten outside a condo building in New York last week while bystanders looked on without helping. And of course, 2 weeks earlier, 8 people, including 6 women of Asian descent, were shot and killed at 3 Atlanta area spas, with authorities still deciding whether a hate crime is a hate crime. These are just some in a wave of recent attacks on Asian Americans, which have surged in the past year since the coronavirus first started to spread in the U.S. and the former president began normalizing racist phrases like the China virus and worse. As of their latest report, the group Stop Asian American Pacific Islander, or AAPI Hate, has received more than 3,700 reports of attacks since last March. More than 400 of them were physical assaults. Many others were verbal harassment, which often referenced Donald Trump's racist phrases. I'm joined now by the former mayor of Fitchburg, Lisa Wong, who's now town manager in Winchester, Boston Globe columnist Shirley Leung, and Kami Rieck, a senior at Boston University, who wrote a piece in the Globe about the racism she's experienced as a Chinese American. All three of you, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. You know, to listen to most Americans, even those with empathy for victims of racism, many act as if anti-Asian animus began with Donald Trump. It did not. Lisa, could you share a piece of the story you told Shirley about your time as mayor of Fitchburg?
Sure. I was mayor about 15 years ago, so certainly anti-Asian racism dates back then. But I just want to emphasize that what's happening recently is that the racial trauma that the Atlanta shootings is bringing up and the reaction from the public and the press and law enforcement is really bringing up and reinforcing decades of anti-Asian racism that I think us on the call are facing. But it also is reminiscent of generations of hate that our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and so on have faced since the beginning of this country. So, but as an elected official, 12.5 years ago, I would have to say, you're a public target anyway. So, I hate to say this, it kind of brings the worst in people. So getting death threats and hate mail, a lot of it fairly racist or sexist, was not surprising. But, it certainly doesn't speak well for society as a whole.
And did this stop when you moved to Winchester, which is, I think, a demographically different kind of community, at least I would assume. Did it stop? You experienced it there as well?
Certainly didn't get the level of hate mail as an elected official would, but I think we're realizing that hate doesn't have any boundaries. It's not just for elected officials. In fact, it's my friends and my family, and it's when we go to the grocery store, when we walk down the street. It's on TV, so it's everywhere.
Kami, you wrote in your piece in the Globe in part, this is one line, "Not till I was 21 did I allow myself to acknowledge a lifelong racial trauma." Could you explain that a little bit to us?
Yeah, I think people like me have been so conditioned to waiting for the rest of the country, especially white people, to confront and learn about anti-Asian discrimination. And writing that piece was very liberating for me because, I grew up with teachers and adults who didn't necessarily label the treatment as racist or as discriminatory. And so if those adults can't do it in your life, how are you supposed to speak up about that as a young child? And so I think that it's unfortunate that 6 women had to be brutally killed for everyone to acknowledge the treatment against Asian women. And I think writing that piece allowed me to find my voice, and it felt very freeing to do as well.
Kami, do you mind sharing some of what you experienced as a kid in school?
Yeah. One of the pieces that I pointed out in that piece was a boy in my class saying that Fridays were National Hate Asian Woman Days. And, that wasn't the first incident of racism that I experienced. In fact, that was in 8th grade, and I had been experiencing that since the start of middle school. And like I said, I didn't necessarily have teachers who openly talked about systemic racism and hate against Asian Americans. And I think not having the knowledge to know what that treatment was, it's made me very angry growing up. And I think, yeah.
You know, Shirley, you said something to Marjorie Egan and me on the radio today that has stuck with me all day. Is you were talking about your parents saying to you that, you know, racism is out there, but you should just ignore it. How did you receive that advice as a kid?
You know, my parents were originally immigrated from China. They came here, spoke very little English, and you know, I was born here. And from the very get-go, they told me that you might be born in the U.S., you might speak perfect English, but you will never be fully accepted as an American, and you will always be treated as a foreigner. So, you know, why fight it was basically their message, and I think Lisa and Kami can probably have similar messages from their parents. And almost every Asian American I know has a very similar story, especially if their parents are immigrants. But for me now, as you know, I have my own kids now. You know, I'm Chinese, my husband's Korean, so I have two little boys, 8 and 10. They're Chinese Korean. And the fact that I have to give them the talk now, that I have to tell them that based on the color of their skin, they may be a victim of a hate crime. They may get verbally and physically assaulted. That's where I draw the line, that we cannot live by the previous generation's advice to ignore or accept racism. And I give a lot of credit to Kami and Lisa for telling their stories, perhaps sometimes for the first time so publicly. That takes a lot of courage. When I look back, you know, of course, I've had ethnic slurs thrown at me growing up as a child, but you know, everyone, you can just read the comments on my stories or the tweets. They are out there, and they troll me, and they're misogynistic, and they're racist. They are out there, and so we need to stand up to them.
You know, Lisa, you said something interesting. I think it was in Shirley's column, but I read it somewhere. The lack of support after being victimized by racism is another form of racism. Is that the rule that you've experienced, the lack of support, or is this from time to time?
I think it's continuous. The lack of support, I think, relates to the invisibility of anti-Asian racism. It also relates to the daily microaggressions, the comments, the looks, the exclusions, the stereotyping. That happens quite common, and it is harmful to hear from, you know, people in the same orbit. They could be friends or family or colleagues that, you know, they're doing almost everything the same thing you're doing, and they're not seeing anything wrong. It makes you feel like things that you're experiencing are invisible. And then when something bigger happens, like let's say there is, you know, the terminology Wuhan virus or racial slur or something a little bit more aggressive. And I think that there's still a hope or expectation that others will see that and they will respond. But when they don't, it kind of reinforces the invisibility. You internalize those remarks. Yeah. You think that there's something wrong with you. And that cycle, because that cycle has been lifelong, it's really hard to overcome. And I've often been surprised at times that I didn't speak out when things happen to me, because again, it's that advice that Shirley talked about, that of course we don't want to do something that goes against our parents, but it is hard to speak out about it.
Kami, it's a different time in some ways, at least. I think when it comes to racism, I can convincingly say, at least to myself, that Joe Biden is the anti-Trump. There has been much more focus on what you three have been talking about since these gruesome murders in Atlanta. Do you see a shift in how the public perceives what you were all talking about, or is this just a blip on a screen?
Yeah, it was, I mentioned in my piece that this was really the first time where I had witnessed people from all backgrounds speak openly about violence against Asian women. And I think, you know, it is unfortunate that we have to see an elderly woman being stomped on in New York City to spark that conversation. But I do think that hopefully even the industry that we're in, journalism and the media, can continue to talk about these experiences, because like everyone else has been saying on this panel, it's not new. Anti-Asian discrimination isn't new, but our stories have just often been brushed aside.
You know, Shirley, it's not just journalists, and I agree with what Kami had to say. Our schools have so failed us in so many ways. I was talking last night to the head of King Boston and one of their artists in residence. Don Lemon was on the radio with us the other day from CNN after he wrote a book about racism. And I plead ignorance about so much of African-American history in this country. And in the weeks since Atlanta, I didn't know about the mass lynchings in L.A. in the early 1800s. Many Americans don't know that those who were interned, obviously in World War II, were Americans of Japanese descent. The Chinese Exclusion Act, Vincent Chin, on and on and on. There's a huge blank spot, and I assume if we filled in those blanks, things might begin to change. Is that overly optimistic?
That is the first step. We have to educate ourselves, and we have to bring awareness to what has happened to Asian Americans in this country. Right now, the model minority myth is the predominant narrative that we're all college educated, we're all well off. Some of us are, but some of us are among the poorest households in the city of Boston. And some of us don't have a college education, barely speak English. Some of us need a lot of help. And yet, what the rest of society likes to focus on is just the folks who have made it. And so there's a lot of work to be done about talking about the economic disparities and the disparities in general within the Asian American community.
Do you, Shirley, starting with you, and then I want to go through all three of you briefly if I can, do you feel fear in the world? Do you carry that with you every day?
I'm so glad you asked that question. I would say this is the first time in my life, and I'm almost a half century, where I actually fear. And the overriding fear is not necessarily me, though when I go out at night, I think twice. Is it dark? Is it too dark? I shouldn't go out when it's too dark. I worry about my mother, my widowed mother, my 71-year-old mother in San Francisco. I tell her, I give her the talk. Don't go out alone. And I worry about my kids. I worry about them being traumatized. I mean, they don't even know, the 8-year-old doesn't know he's Asian. He doesn't even know that he's different. And so I worry about them. I fear for them. Yeah. I feel like I'm at a point where I can take care of myself. But my mom and my kids, that's where that's where my kind of anger and kind of we need to do something comes from.
How about you, Kami?
Yeah, just to echo what Shirley said, I think I've thought a lot about the young Asian girls and boys who are going to grow up during this time, especially in places just where those spaces aren't designed to serve them. For me, I know that I live in a predominantly white area and grew up in a white city in Indiana, and I'm the only Asian person in my family. And so I have thought about how transracial adoptees how their families are approaching these conversations, and how the adults in their lives are talking to them about racism. Because I think when you're so young and experiencing that, you don't know what that treatment is, and facing microaggressions and subtle and blatant racism every day really affects how one carries themselves. So yes, I've really thought about the generation.
How about you, Lisa?
I would definitely say that there is a constant level of stress worrying about my kids, and also worrying about my parents and worrying about my friends and community. I think that to deal with that stress, we try to find a sense of safety But I'm finding that, again, your education, where you live, all those things don't really provide you that sense of safety when you are seeing things in the news that sort of spike your fear. I was told recently that, well, it sounds like you're anxious. To deal with your anxiety, you have to understand that the fear is only in your head. It's not real. That it's what you see on the news that's making you scared. But the problem is when it's happening to my friends and family, when it's happening to me, I mean, unfortunately, I am knowing more and more people that are affected, both physically and verbally. People, my friends who are being threatened taking the subway, family friend who was left brutalized in New York. I mean, when these things happen to people you know, that advice doesn't work anymore. And the strategies that we have been talking about to cope with our racism, including ignoring it, that doesn't work anymore. And I find that to overcome my fear, I need to talk about it more. I need to bring that fear into the daylight so that we can address it together.
I'm really glad you're doing that. Lisa Wong, Kami Rieck, Shirley Leung, thanks to all three of you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim, for highlighting this issue. It's important to Boston and it's important to us, so thank you.
Thank you.